The Seder in 2026 is 100% about only one thing, and that is our wish and our desire to be free, just like our ancestors was in Egypt.
Welcome to the Chavrusa with Rabbi Levi Farkash, where we uncover the deeper meaning behind the Torah and the powerful lessons it holds for our lives today. In the Haggadah, we are taught to remember two very different experiences. On the one hand, halachma anya, this is the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in Egypt. And, on the other hand, the matzah also reminds us that we left Egypt in haste, in a moment of redemption. So which is it? Is the Seder about slavery or about freedom? And if remembering suffering is so central, why is it that today the mitzvah of maror is only rabbinic, while matzah remains a biblical obligation? Tonight, Rabbi Levi Farkash will explore how the focus of the Seder shifts in our time, and why the avoda of Pesach today is not only to reveal exile, but to live with a mindset of redemption. Let's begin.
We are back with another Chavrusa learning. We are a few weeks from the holiday of Pesach, from the holiday of Passover, and over the next couple weeks, we are going to be learning fascinating insights to prepare us to have a very, very meaningful Passover. Today's insight is going to talk about a very, very interesting discussion about some of the unique items that we use during the Passover Seder, and that is the matzah and the Chavrusa. We know that the matzah is the unleavened bread that the Jews took out of Egypt, and the Chavrusa is one of the things we put on our Seder table to resemble the bricks and the mortar. And what we're going to study today is the significance of those mitzvahs, how they work together, and what does that mean for us that in 2026. So join us in Source 1, straight from the Haggadah. Why do we eat matzah? It says in the Haggadah, Halach ma'anya, this is the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Whoever is hungry, come eat with us. Whoever is needy, come and join the Passover Seder. The matzah that we eat, what's it all about? Because the dough of our ancestors did not have time to become leavened before the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He, revealed Himself to them and redeemed them. As it said, they baked matzah cakes from the dough and they had brought out of Egypt because it was not leavened, for they had been driven out of Egypt and could not delay. And they had also not prepared any other provisions, right? So from the two Haggadah passages, we learn that eating matzah is a reminder of the servitude, the blood of affliction, right, of the hardship that we had in Egypt. And while at the second time, it also refers to the redemption, the leaving of Egypt in haste. And that is why we eat matzah, to remember these two specific points. Source number 2, directly from the Torah, Deuteronomy. You shall not eat leaven with it. For 7 days you shall eat with it matzah, the bread of affliction. For in haste you went out of the land of Egypt, so that you shall remember the day when you went out of the land of Egypt, all the days of your life. Rashi explains, what does it mean, the bread of affliction? Bread that recalls suffering in Egypt. And what does it mean, in haste that you went out, and the dough wasn't able to rise? The matzah reminds us of this. The haste wasn't ours, but the haste of the Egyptians to drive us out of Egypt, right? So Rashi explains and tells us that the bread of affliction hints to the idea that matzah reminds us of the suffering that we experienced in Egypt, while it also reminds us of the idea that we left in haste, that the redemption, right? So matzah has a dual meaning. Now the question is, we know one of the other major highlights is the maror, right? The bitter herbs. Why do we eat maror? Says the Torah, Exodus 12:8. On this night they shall eat the flesh roasted over the fire, and matzah with bitter herbs you shall eat it, right? So the Torah tells us that the Passover offering should be eaten together with matzah and maror, but it does not explain why. The Haggadah explains us why we eat maror. Why do we eat maror? Says the Haggadah. Maror, what do we eat? Because the Egyptians embittered our ancestors' lives in Egypt. As it said, they made their lives bitter with hard service, with mortar, with bricks, and with all the manner of service in the field, all their service which they made them serve with rigor, right? So the maror reminds us of the bitter, difficult times that we had in Egypt, particularly with the labor that we had to do in Egypt. Now we know that there's a Seder plate, right? Every Seder has a Seder plate, and on the Seder plate, there is a few interesting items. We have the egg that has a certain symbolism. We have the charoset as well, which reminds us of something very unique. Now we're going to discuss why charoset is placed on the Seder and how is it prepared. For this, we're going to turn to the Rambam, Maimonides, regarding the laws of chametz and matzah. Says the Rambam, the charoset is a mitzvah that was ordained by the sages to commemorate the clay which our forefathers worked in Egypt. How is it made? You take dates, dried figs, raisins, similar fruits, crush them, add vinegar, and mix them with spices, just as clay is mixed with straw. This is placed on the table on the first 2 nights of Passover. So Maimonides continues and tells us and explains that both the matzah and the maror are dipped in this charoset, this mixture, right? And however, that's according to his opinion. There are other opinions that say that you should not dip the matzah into the charoset for the worry of it becoming a leaven product, right? Says the Rambam, what do? You take the matzah and maror together, you dip them in charoset, and you say the blessing, right? Then you eat it. Says the Rebbe, right? The Rebbe makes a comment, and he brings the Ravid, which is one of the, very unique commentaries. And the Ravid responds to the Rambam's opinion about dipping matzah in charoset. What does the Ravid say? The Ravid writes that there is absolutely no requirement to dip the matzah in charoset. And the Ravid quotes, this is nonsense. That's what he says. Now, a number of commentators point out already that Maimonides' source is the writing of the Gaonim, as the Torah cites, right, the Siddur of Rabbi Amram Gaon, which was written before the time of Maimonides, and this is referenced by the Rambam in a few places, right? What does the Amram Gaon say? Source number 6, he says, after making the hamotzi, you should dip the matzah in charoset and eat it. Right, so we have 2 opinions regarding about the use of the charoset. We have the Rambam that maintains that charoset is meant for both the matzah and the maror to be dipped into it, while Ravid and other commentaries say that you should not dip the matzah into the charoset. However, the maror is something you could dip. Now the question is, what caused the Ravid to sharply comment on the Rambam's opinion that it is absolutely nonsense to dip the matzah into charoset, right? What's wrong? What's wrong? So to this, the Rebbe is going to give us a fascinating insight from which we're going to learn very much practical lessons on the idea between the meaning of the uniqueness of the Seder. Says the Rebbe, an explanation of the debate between the Rambam and the Ravid can be found in a work by the Rogatchover Gaon called Tzafnat Paneach. The Rogatchover, right, explains that the Ravid actually agrees with the Rambam, with Maimonides, and says that during temple times we do dip matzah into charoset. The old disagreement comes regarding the ruling of dipping matzah in charoset during the present day when we're in exile, right? So the question is why? So regarding the difference between the time of the temple and the present day, the Rogatchover explains that we know there are 2 reasons why we eat matzah. One, as we mentioned before, the hardship of Egypt, the bread of affliction as it's called. And the other reason is because we left Egypt in haste, right? Freedom. Maror, however, has only one purpose. Why do we eat maror? To remind us of the slavery. The charoset, which resembles the bricks, also reminds us of slavery, the clay that we used. Therefore, says the Rogatchover, that during the time of the temple, matzah was dipped in charoset, even according to the Ravid, because it's part of the reminder to remember the difficulty of Egypt. Right? In the times of the temple, everything was in place. The charoset reminds us of the bricks, and it symbolized servitude. The maror reminds us of the bitterness of the servitude. And it was straightforward that the maror was dipped into charoset to remind us of the servitude. The matzah was a reminder of both the hardship and the freedom. So it makes sense that the matzah would be dipped in charoset, right? The matzah, the poverty represented by the matzah, corresponds to the servitude by the Chavrusa they had to do with each other. Just like the maror represented hardship, we dipped it into Chavrusa, represented hardship. So to matzah, which one of the reasons that we eat matzah is to remind ourselves of the hardship, it was dipped also into Chavrusa to remind ourselves of the hardship. Says the Rogachover, that was in temple times that things made sense. Now, in a post-temple era, we see that the mitzvah, right? The mitzvah to remind ourselves of a slavery is only a rabbinic obligation. The commandment to remind ourselves of the bitter times in Egypt no longer is a biblical commandment now that we are not in now that we are no longer in temple times. And he explains. Says the Talmud. Rava says the mitzvah of matzah of today, even after destruction of by temple, is by Torah law. But the mitzvah to eat bitter herbs is rabbinic law. And the Gemara asks, in what way is the mitzvah of bitter herbs different from that of matzah? Right? The verse states regarding the Paschal lamb, you should eat it with matzah and bitter herbs. So the Gemara says we derive this from that when there is an obligation to eat the Paschal lamb, then there's also a mitzvah to eat bitter herbs, right? Temple times, we brought sacrifices. So we had the Paschal lamb. Our seders were accompanied by the actual Paschal sacrifice. So the biblical commandment to eat the Paschal sacrifice, only applying in temple times, also meant that the maror, which was a part of that mitzvah, it says a matzah maror you should eat together with the Paschal sacrifice, was also only to be done in temple times, right? So the Gemara says, yeah, but what about the matzah, right? So why does the matzah stay biblical, right? Why does the matzah stay biblical? So the Gemara answers, because matzah has a dual purpose. Yes, on one hand, it reminds us of the servitude, but on the other hand, it reminds us of freedom. Now, the servitude aspect is no longer applicable, not in temple times, just like the maror reminds us of servitude and is no longer biblical. So too, that aspect of the matzah is no longer biblical. However, the aspect of freedom that the matzah brings, that we still have. That is biblical. So we're going to have now a guest speaker, Eitan Rindi, right? It's going to read for us the source of number 8 about the biblical obligation to eat maror, that it's only in temple times.
The reason the sages enacted a requirement to eat maror and dip in Chavrusa is to serve as a reminder of the temple. The biblical obligation to eat maror is only applicable in temple's times. Nowadays, it is a rabbinic commandment enacted by sages to remember the temple.
Right? So here we have the Alter Rebbe that states clearly that the only reason why we eat maror in exile without the temple is just to remind us of what they did in temple times. It's a rabbinic enactment to remind how we did the Seder in the temple, where maror was a biblical obligation because it went along with the Paschal sacrifice. That was biblical only where you were able to bring sacrifices in the temple. So the question is, what changed? What's the difference? Right? You want to say we don't have the Paschal sacrifice. Okay, fine. But the idea of maror, to remember the slavery, the idea of the matzah, to remember slavery, why is that no longer biblical? Right? Why does it only become rabbinic in exile, where we still don't have the temple? So the Rebbe explains. The reason why in the present day the mitzvah associated with remembering slavery is no longer in effect, because the reminder of slavery is only used when there's no slavery. In those circumstances where a person is truly free, so you have to remind ourselves the slavery that was. So during the temple time, when we were not in a state of slavery, right? So we had to have a reminder through the maror, right? And the dipping in the Chavrusa that reminded us that we were slaves in Egypt. However, in the present day, since we are in exile, which itself is a form of slavery, we don't have the base of Mikdash, we don't have God revealed to us, right? So it's very similar in a way to the experience of slavery felt in Egypt. So therefore, we don't need a reminder biblically to remind us about what it was like to be in Egypt because we have similar experience now, right? The Seder, we are meant to experience two feelings. One, a feeling of servitude as our forefathers experienced in Egypt, and a feeling of freedom similar to the departure. In the years the temple stood, the Jewish people performed rituals and reminded themselves of these two extremes. However, after the destruction of the temple, the Jewish people experienced servitude every day. We're still in exile, right? And therefore, after the temple was destroyed and we were expelled from the land and we were in this, where we are still in this long exile, we don't need to have the rituals performed to remind ourselves of the slavery, right? Therefore, the Passover Seder says that the mitzvah of eating maror and dipping into the Chavrusa is not something necessary, right? You don't need them to feel the bitterness and the servitude. As for the matzah, if the mitzvah to eat the matzah, it's not been completely nullified, right? Because one of the reasons of that we eat matzah is freedom, right? It's freedom. So yes, on one hand, one of the dual aspects of matzah to remind ourselves of the bread of affliction, of how it was in Egypt. Yes, that is not bound to the mitzvah of matzah that we eat in the times of exile. However, the reminding ourselves of freedom, that very much applies till today in exile. We strive to be free. We wish to be free. We hope to be free. We can't wait to be free. That component of the matzah is 100% relevant and 100% biblical. However, even though in exile we shouldn't really be doing the maror and the Chavrusa because it doesn't apply, the sages said no. You should still take the maror by the Seder and you should still dip it in Chavrusa. And the reason why you should have that is because that if the exile, God forbid, should last a very long time, which it has, that the children of Israel should remember how we conducted a Seder in temple times, right? So there's an interesting idea that in exile, we do not have a biblical commandment to commemorate the hardship of Egypt. However, we do have a biblical mandate and commandment to remind ourselves of the freedom and redemption, and that is something that applies. So says the Rebbe, based on the above, about the difference between the temple times and present day, everything becomes clear. According to the Rebbe, who mentioned that he frowned upon the idea of the Rambam mentioning to dip maror and Chavrusa, he says that during the time of the temple, since matzah also contained an element of slavery, there was a reason to dip it into Chavrusa, which also symbolizes slavery, right? However, in the present day, since the mitzvah associated with remembering the slavery is no longer in effect, therefore, there should absolutely be no dipping the matzah into the Chavrusa, which represents slavery, right? The Rambam says that you should not dip it whatsoever. You don't need to remind it. It's not a biblical commandment anymore. And therefore, the fact that the Rambam says you should dip it into Chavrusa, it's complete nonsense. However, the Rambam maintains, no. The Rambam says even though we're in exile, we should still dip the matzah into Chavrusa. Why? Why, according to the Rambam, should we still dip the matzah in the Chavrusa? So here we have a very interesting idea. The Rambam says, according to the Ravid says, no, we keep the things that were done in the temple the way they're done in the temple. We keep the things that are done in exile the way they're done in exile. No confusion. Rambam says differently, right? Maimonides holds that we have to establish this idea of Zeichel and Mikdash, the way things are done in the Mikdash, and therefore, while it's not biblically commandment, we still have to remind us of what was done in the temple. And so the Rebbe concludes the reason why during exile there's no biblical obligation to eat maror is because exile itself is maror, and therefore there's no need to further stress the bitterness on something that can lead to despondency. However, during the temple era, there's a need to remember and conscious the redemption to preceding exile. Nowadays, the main thing is to remember the redemption, which gives us strength to bring about the ultimate redemption from the current exile. So the Rebbe brings up a very interesting point, highlighted by this discussion. We're about to sit in a couple weeks at the Seder, and we're going to be having matzah, and there's going to be maror and Chavrusa, but we have to be educated. We have to understand what is the most important thing to remind ourselves in the Seder of 2026, right? Conventional wisdom would tell you, traditionally, a big component to the Seder is the slavery. A big component is to remind ourselves what it was like to be in Egypt. But after digging deep into the rabbis of old and the sages of old, the way that they teach us about the certain elements of the Seder, we understand actually what the Seder in 2026 is about. The Seder in 2026 is 100% about only one thing, and that is our wish and our desire to be free, just like our ancestors was in Egypt. That's our mindset. Our mindset should not be about the fact that we were enslaved, because we're still enslaved. Our mindset shouldn't be we suffered, because we're still suffering. The Pesach Seder of 2026, the expression at the Seder has to be at all times an expression of freedom, because that's the biblical mitzvah in today's day regarding Passover. So friends, I hope that you shared some insight. Yes, we still have the Chavrusa on the table. Yes, we still dip the maror into the Chavrusa, but according to Chabad custom, we do not dip the matzah into Chavrusa. And again, I'm wishing everybody a Zman Cherutenu, a season of freedom, because that is what we should be experiencing at Pesach 2026.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's Chavruta with Rabbi Levi Farkash. For sponsorship and dedication opportunities, email rabbi.levi@chabaddowntownbellevue.org. Also, you can follow Rabbi Levi Farkash at facebook.com/Chabad Downtown Bellevue. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.